If we're thinking about what healthcare would look like outside of white supremacy, indigeneity would be centered.
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy and a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Courtney Watson is a licensed marriage and family therapist who has a lot to teach us about taking care of our own mental health and the mental health of our friends in queer communities and communities of color, otherwise known as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Aside from the normal tribulations of modern life and the traumas of embodied existence, people from marginalized communities face oppression, abuse, and poverty at higher rates. A person of color might need care from somebody who looks like them. An Indigenous patient might need to be healed by Indigenous practices. And a trans person might work best with somebody who understands their experience navigating assigned versus true gender. Courtney Watson understands that the diversity of human life requires a diversity of human care. And healthy minds require healthy communities, and vice versa. Everybody has their roots, and she encourages us to respect and embrace that. And we can all learn a lot about our own place in history and how to use that for our own well-being by listening to this powerful conversation with Courtney Watson. Also, in this episode, she encourages people to learn more. So after the interview, I'll share some of the books and works that help me to understand race and racism in the United States. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Courtney Watson. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you are a therapist going in a lot of interesting directions, individual couples therapy, sex therapy, you do ketamine infusions at your clinic, and it seems like your clinic is just a rad place to be in the Bay Area. And so I wanted to start off with something about the people you work with and your work as a therapist. I read in one interview where you said you work with queer people, you work with people of color, and there's always a common thread of some sort of trauma. There's always a common thread of marginalization. There's always a common thread of historical oppression. So for you, how does that impact the beginning of therapy, and how do you help ease people into the therapeutic alliance?
I mean, I think that this is a great question. And I think that this is why I'm a strong advocate for like folks within the community as therapists offering services to our clients who are in the community, because we don't have to do a lot to build an alliance, because we don't have to overcome like a power differential in a lot of ways. I mean, like intersectionality is a thing. There's different ways that I'm privileged and folks are subjugated, and there's different ways that there's privilege and I'm subjugated in terms of our identities and our experiences. But there is a trust that you don't have to explain things. There's microaggressions you know that you won't face when you're working and sitting with folks that look like you or have similar lived experiences as you. And so this idea of how we build the therapeutic alliance is we're just us, you know, and in our own identities and experiences as queer and BIPOC therapists, we have the understandings of what our clients experience as queer BIPOC folks. And also, like, if I'm thinking about my privilege as a cisgender person, we also work with people that are gender expansive as well. And so like being able to really hold my position as a, not just an ally, but a co-conspirator in pushing the agenda of support and of like anti-oppression and showing up for communities. I think that when you're actively involved in that type of work, it also just kind of shows through in the way that you show up in the room. I do want to make one clarification. We don't do ketamine infusions. We do injections and lozenge. Infusions is the IV, and we don't have capacity to do that type of work.
Oh, okay. That's good. Yeah, we'll, good. I was going to jump in that a little bit later, but that's good to know. And the thing that you brought up there, one thing, could you define intersectionality and how you deal with that in your practice?
There are definitions. I think I'd rather talk about the way that I experience it, and like hopefully the definition comes through from there. So like for me, I'm Black, right? I'm queer. I'm a mother. I have a co-parent, so I'm not married. And there's different ways that I will face different oppressions from those different places, right? So like there's different ways that I will face oppression as a Black person. There's different ways that I'll face oppression as a cisgender woman. There's different ways that I'll face oppression as a person who is not married. raising children in the Bay Area where rent and mortgages are ridiculous, right? So there's different places where I face oppression, and sometimes it can be all at once depending on who I'm with, or sometimes it can be one aspect of myself as a subjugated person is really highlighted in comparison to someone's privilege, or one aspect of myself as a privileged person is really highlighted in comparison to someone's subjugation. Like, I'm highly educated, right? Like, that is a privilege that I have. I own my own business. That is a privilege that I have. I own my home. That is a privilege that I have. And so, like, intersectionality is the reality of the different privileges that we hold, and also the different areas of oppression that we might face within like one person. And so, like, that is what intersectionality is to me. And I think the second question was the way it shows up in the therapy room.
Yes.
So the way that might show up in the therapy room is like from the various places of not privilege, the various places of subjugation that I hold, I can understand the various places of subjugation that a client might experience. From the various places of privilege that I hold, I need to be aware of any dynamics where there's potential for harm through microaggressions, or just being aware of there's realities and hardships that I don't have to face as someone with certain privileges that my clients might have to face. And so in the therapy room, it's this dance of like myself in my places of privilege and myself in places of subjugation, and then also being a full person in the room and just being able to show up for my client where I'm not centering myself at all, but like really holding like what their reality is around their privileges and their subjugations.
That makes sense. And I think one of the first quotes that ever helped me get that idea across was, I think it was Billie Holiday, but I can never quite remember, who said that she experienced far more prejudice being a woman than she did being a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And that it helped me to understand how many different layers can line up and make life harder for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that makes sense depending on where you are too, right? Like, I might have a lot more areas of difficulty being a woman, maybe in a society where patriarchy is dominant or the norm, than I would necessarily as a Black person. But if I go to a place where racism is like overt and rampant, because racism is everywhere, but when it's overt and rampant, I might have more experiences of oppression as a Black person than a woman. And I think it also is true across time too. So across space and time, the different parts of us that experience oppression are highlighted depending on where we are and who we're standing across from.
And so I wanted to ask about more recent events too. For your clients and for the people in your community, how have you seen people get affected by this year with a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, but as well the pandemic lockdown and all the craziness that comes from both of those?
Yeah, I feel like those are two really big separate questions in terms of the second iteration of Black Lives Matters movement really picking up steam. I don't just see Black folks, so I'm thinking about BIPOC folks, I'm thinking about white folks, and I'm thinking about Black folks. But if I can separate that a little bit, like for Black folks, this has been our reality since we came to this continent, since we were forced to come here. Like, we have been murdered, and we've always known that we're not safe and our bodies are not safe, and that the police or law enforcement, it started with slave patrols. Like, that is the origins of law enforcement in this country. And so this is not new. It's just we're seeing it a lot more and we're hearing it a lot more. Like, it's not just sitting over the kitchen table overhearing your grandma talk about so-and-so who got killed by the police. It's seeing it on the media and having everyone around you talking about it. And I think that is a particular hardship to never be able to get away, like take a mental break, being able to engage dissociation around the fact that your body is not safe here and that at any time you can be murdered. I got pulled over because I had a headlight out and I was bawling because at the end of the day, you never know how that's going to end, right? Sandra Bland got pulled over because she didn't turn on her blinker and she was the same age as me. So just the inability to get away from it is really hard. And I think people find ways to escape when they can. And then also, like, the thing that I love about Black folks is the way that we laugh, and using laughter as a source of survival and as a source of getting away. And so bringing in comedy, bringing in lightness to something that is dark is how we survived on this continent for so long without being exterminated. For BIPOC folks, I think the reflection. I mean, it's not just happening in Black communities, it happens in all communities, right? It happens in all communities that are not white, where we are targeted because of it happens in Latinx communities. And we've seen recently that the model minority myth, the stereotype, that doesn't even protect Asian folks or East Asian folks, right? I should say. No, I think there were some South Asian folks that were killed too, so I'll say Asian folks, right? Like, no community of color is safe under white supremacy. And the realities of that being stuck inside of the house and not being able to get out and necessarily touch people or hug people is really, really hard. So the pandemic has compounded that. But I also think the pandemic has highlighted that as well. And as hard as it is, the ways that the pandemic has brought this to the forefront in a way that none of us can escape it is actually really important, because it means that more and more people are able to see that folks are not just playing the race card, or they're not just talking about the race thing again. They're actually able to see, oh no, this is real. Folks have been saying for a long time that we're not safe here. And when you can't go nowhere and all you got is your TV, you have no option but to see the truth. As long as you have eyes to see, you can always close your eyes and be like, it's still not real.
Yeah, I just see online that the greatest gaslighting of all is defining people here by their race, making it the most important thing, and then saying, oh, you make everything about race.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
What you were saying earlier, never knowing if it's going to be safe, was the thing I read first in Langston Hughes, talking about the double vision that you must have as a person of color, especially a Black person here, where you have to see yourself from the outside and know how you appear, to know that, and to be thinking about, do I appear safe enough? Are my hands not moving enough? Am I looking too dangerous here? And as someone who grew up as a white boy in farm country Pennsylvania, it's so foreign. Mm-hmm. There was nothing like that. And even going to a city like New York and the unsafe neighborhoods, you never had to think like that. And it's just so foreign to my thinking. And is that something that comes up a lot, that you hear from people, that double vision kind of thinking in the therapy rooms?
It's like a fish in water. You don't think about it, you just swim in. It's a reality that we all have grown up in since the day that we were born, I mean, when I was pregnant with my son, I think it was around the election time, and there was like a lot of violence that was happening. And like, as a person who was carrying a child, I was like, I don't know that I'll walk down the street and be safe, right? Like, so there was this sense of unsafety for my child when I was carrying him. There's no not thinking about it. And I think responsible parentage, and this might be controversial, but I think for me to be a responsible parent, I have to prepare my child for that reality, because what really sucks is when a kid is not prepared for that reality and they think that maybe something like class or education will make them an exception until they realize that they're Black, and it's usually not a nice realization when all of a sudden you have a gun pointed in your face and you thought you were good because you spoke a particular way and you went to all the right schools and you got all the right degrees. In 2016, one of the young ladies that graduated from my college was murdered by the police. She had a bachelor's degree in biology. Nothing protects us, and that's just the reality. There is no protection. And so living in a white supremacist society, or a society that is built on the foundations of white supremacy, there's no point where it's not a reality for you. It's always a reality for you. And that is true in the psychedelic space as well.
And those were the two I wanted to ask about next. Is mental health is your first love, you might say, or what you have a ton of degrees in, almost a PhD now, which is great.
Sex is actually my first love.
Okay. Yeah, a BS in psychology, an MS in marriage and family therapy, an MED in human sexuality, and now almost a PhD in sexuality, human sexuality. That's great. That's a lot of high-level studying of some of the roughest, rawest, most important stuff that we do.
Yeah.
But I was going to get to sex more at the end. I wanted to ask about, so much about the mental health world. I've been in it for so long. What would you see as the steps for dismantling white supremacy in mental health in this country, in the United States?
It is built into the institutions. It's built into mental health. It's built into the medical field. It's built into healthcare. The only way to dismantle it would be if we had different systems and systems that were not, for example, gynecology. The origins of gynecology are based on J. Marion Sims' The Speculum. I think it was something, there was some other gynecological practices that he developed on enslaved African women without anesthesia, right? And so, like, when we're talking about dismantling white supremacy within the mental health system or the healthcare system, like, it has to be a completely different system because it's literally built on not just Black bodies, but also brown bodies, like the experimentation that happened on brown bodies as well. There has to be a different system. And actually, the system is largely about profit right now. It's about money. It's not about health. And so when we think about like extracting or doing something different, the whole system has to change in the way that we do it.
What would it look like if we could give you personally a large grant to be doing the kind of work you do in your community? What would you be doing with that money?
Oh, I would be, if I think about just mental health or health in general. And I think the reason I keep on going between health and mental health is because I actually don't see them separate. And I think that the separation of physical health, mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health is actually like a byproduct of colonization, because that's not how communities of color see health, right? And that's definitely not how Black communities, Indigenous, Black, West African communities saw health. It's all of it, right? Like your spiritual health, your emotional health, your physical health, your mental health is all one thing. And so if I had the ability to undo white supremacy in the healthcare system, it would not be separate. There would be no separation of mental health and physical health and spiritual health. It would all be together. It would be funded. We would have elders who have Indigenous practices, like bringing that knowledge into the system, and even centering. In the United States, we would center American Indigenous practices. And also, because there's so many of us, for Black folks, we didn't have a choice about whether or not we were come here. We'd also be bringing in practices like hoodoo, practices, African diasporic practices like candomblé and santeria and palo mayombe and ifa, and like African traditional practices from like West Africa. Like all of that would be a part of our healthcare system now here, because that's actually how we meet the needs of everyone and not just how we meet the needs of white folks, right? All of the research, predominantly the research that we have, unless it specifically says like you're targeting a specific ethnic group, it's done on middle class white folks. And so our health research isn't actually about service to communities of color, but the places where we have that knowledge, thousands of year old knowledge, is with the Indigenous elders who are still carrying these medicines. And so if we're thinking about what healthcare would look like outside of white supremacy, it would have a lot more indigeneity would be centered.
I hear the same thing, too, in reading Nature about the genomes that are out there. On one side, you see a constant call, we don't have enough Black genomes in the mix, so everything is geared towards white folks. And on the same side, you see Indigenous people protesting about how their genomes are getting used, used without consent. And it's actually very cool to see some new models coming out in the scientific community where they work with Indigenous people and get their input into what's happening and work every step of the way to how these genomes might be used, how this traditional medicine might be used. And it's fascinating to see a new way forward. But it takes everybody working together, aiming towards that.
And I think even this conversation about like getting genomes is like, it's missing the mark. It's separating still, right? Like you can't take a genome without having like the reality of the full person. And if you're talking about someone that's Black, you mean like you can't just take my genome and not address the fact that there's socioeconomic issues that are at play, the fact that there's racism that at play. Like you can't take a piece of me and do research and then figure out healthcare issues without addressing the systems that I live within. And I think the same is true for Indigenous folks, right? Like participatory action research in science with Indigenous folks, when it's not led by Indigenous folks, will only go so far. Because at the end of the day, if you're not addressing the fact that like there's high suicide rates in Indigenous communities, if you're not addressing land back for Indigenous communities, if you're not addressing the social realities that Indigenous folks are living under, if you're not addressing the fact that there's still we are all occupying unceded land. If you're not addressing that, then you're not actually addressing the health of indigenous communities. You're just trying to take a piece of their DNA. And that sounds really scary. I don't want to give somebody a piece of my DNA if you're not going to dismantle the systems, if this research is not going to lead to like me being able to be safe in the world and not cry after I get pulled over because I have a tail light out.
Amen. And that was such a history of early biomedical research, is pharmaceutical drugs being given in places where it's cheap to do the research, like Nepal, and then sometimes the participants getting promised those drugs afterwards and then just not following through at all. It's as someone who loves studying the history of science, it's awful. I mean, it's as bad as studying the history of the war on drugs, which is, it's funny to hear people say, oh, it was a big, the illegalization of weed was a big business thing, when no, it was always racism from the very beginning. Everything about the war on drugs started and was birthed in racism against Black, brown, and Asian people. And then eventually big business got involved. And so one thing you mentioned interest in talking about was dismantling white supremacy in the psychedelic movement today. So I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same thing, right? Like, people are really focused on the medicines and what the medicine can do. And it's, again, the same separation. You can't take the medicine out of the community. You can't take the medicine out of the people. And that means you also can't take the medicine out of the social conditions that the people are existing in. And everyone is really infatuated with ayahuasca right now. And I had the privilege of being able to witness a panel where indigenous folks were talking about how this works together. And they were like, it doesn't. One person was like, leave us alone, because this is some way participating in the ways that we are currently being genocided. Our land is being burned in Brazil. And like, you're asking about our medicine and you're asking about our knowledge. What about our lives? Like, within the psychedelic community, we have to understand this is not just molecules. These are not just plants. These are whole entire cultures. And the plants are not separate from the people. And so if you're not working to make sure the people have everything they need, if you're not working to make sure people are not being genocided, if you're not working to make sure that people's cultures are not being able to continue to exist, then you are actually participating in something that is harmful and something that is violent. And so when we think about sure, what does that mean? We have a lot of access to wealth out here, and especially the people who are doing psychedelics and can afford to fly down to South America and engage in $1,000 retreats. You have a lot of access to wealth right now. What would it mean to just give financial support to indigenous communities and say, do whatever you need to do with this? I'm not going to tell you what to do with this money. I'm going to give you this money. You need my voice. You need some sort of political pressure applied to politicians or governments or institutions that are trying to erase us. This is what I'm gonna do. That is actually what showing up and dismantling white supremacy in the psychedelic community looks like. I mean, showing up for the indigenous folks, listening to what they need and saying yes, even if they say all we need is your money and your voice, just saying yes.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm going to ask a little bit more about that in a bit. But first, I wanted to just ask some practical things about mental health as we talk about how tough the times are now. Hey, folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is PlusCBD, and the discount code for 20% off is LexFiles. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on PlusCBDoil.com. Number 1, I would give PlusCBD to your grandmother, because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider PlusCBD, the #1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is LexFiles, and the place to use it is PlusCBDoil.com. What have you seen help people get through these times right now? What do you tell people to help them survive?
Overall, if you have a purpose right now, especially earlier on, I feel like we're shifting mental health wise after a year in the pandemic. I feel the first year is something, the second year is something different. The first year, it was all of my clients, I was like, we need to find a purpose right now. No one knows what's going to happen. We don't know how long we're going to be around. Information is changing at the drop of a dime. what is your purpose? What is something that you can focus on? And that purpose was usually related to community. It was usually related to being able to be in some sort of relationship with other people. It was usually related to helping. Like when folks found those purposes, they were able to have their mental health more intact than folks who did not have a purpose. Also, like for me personally, I had the space to be able to ground into indigenous practices. So like whether that's going back to African traditional religions or African diasporic religious practices and grounding and knowledge around that, or also indigenous practices as well. So learning under folks who, especially within the psychedelic community, I do have a lot of access to South American indigenous practices. I do not have any heritage that I might have heritage just because of the transatlantic slave trade, but I don't have a direct linkage that I know of in terms of like paper documentation about my connection to South America. I do have ancestral messages that have come through about my connection to South America, but I do have North American indigenous heritage. I am a descendant of Choctaw people in Louisiana. So being able to ground into indigenous practices and like whatever form of spirituality that resonated with the client, like spiritual health was a huge thing. It's a huge thing that helps mental health. And it's so often neglected, but it was a time when a lot of people were going back to the earth-based practices, connecting with their ancestors. Those sort of practices were also really helpful in grounding for folks. There's a turn that's happening in like mental health now. Like a lot of people have a lot of hope with the vaccines. I don't know. I'd be interested in what the fall looks like or what the winter looks like to see if it shows that like, yes, we had hope and we should have hope, or we had hope and people did a bunch of crazy things and forgot that we were in a pandemic because they had hope. And now we have like sky high rates again. I don't know. We'll see what the winter looks like in terms of people's mental health. But right now, I think that there's a lot of hope. So like people are just being able to have a little bit of a break and a little bit of breath.
For people who are listening who want to be allies to this movement, what advice would you have for being a good ally?
Yeah, I'd say you need to go beyond allyship. You need to be a co-conspirator. First, listen to indigenous voices, listen to people of color, listen to what they say that they need, and then act. I remember I was in psychedelic space. Oh, well, it wasn't psychedelic space. I was in a program for learning how to do psychedelic assisted therapy. And one of my colleagues was like really wanted to show up as an ally and was like having a lot of revelations about the world and the state that people of color are in through connection with me and in this program. And then George Floyd was murdered and was like, oh, I wanted to check in. What should I do? I was like, you should go to a protest. And initially they were hesitant. Initially they said why they didn't want to go to a protest. Like, that's not allyship. That's not allyship. They did eventually go and we're happy that they went. But when you hear a person of color, an indigenous person telling you what they need, you ask for it and then they tell you and then you say, no, that's not being an ally. When you hear someone tell you what they need, they ask for it, you say yes. And you can say yes but it's a yes. And so again, like I said, it's about beyond going to allyship. It's about like being a co-conspirator. Like, white bodies are super important when it comes to protests because the police are not going to murder you. We know this from what happened at the Capitol. You can go across barricades and enter into a federal building where people cannot protest publicly on the streets peacefully without having tear gas and bullets thrown at them, or being captured and be injected with ketamine and overdose, right? Like, there is a certain safety that folks have with their privileges. And so you use that to shield and protect those that don't have privileges. That's actually what allyship looks like. And that in terms of maybe not only protests, but I'm in a room and I'm saying a thing and then I'm getting pushback, or people are like, no, or people are like, rah, 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 rah. I don't like what you're saying, right? Like, I've had a wonderful person that stood up and was like, I just need us all to recognize that this thing is what's happening. This Black woman is speaking and saying this thing, and here's how you're shutting her down. Here's how you're shutting her down. Here's how you're shutting her down. And her question has not been answered yet. And it took someone who has a certain privilege and a white body in order for other white folks to hear and see and then be able to engage with that. Because in my Black body, I was automatically dismissed as angry or whatever projections people were throwing on me from racism. And so like that's what allyship looks like. It like literally standing up, literally using your voice, literally using your financial resources and taking action. Allyship. I keep on going back and forth between allyship and being a co-conspirator, but like it's about action. That's what I'd say it is.
There's a fear among allies of looking like you're jumping on a bandwagon and looking like you're a poser. You know, it's a lot of fear about appearances, which is pretty silly in comparison to the fear of getting murdered. But it's a real fear. It keeps, I think it keeps people from action. And I think one question would be, a line that always comes to me from Jesus is, if you are lukewarm, I will spit you out of my mouth. Hate me or love me, but don't be lukewarm. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things you see that are more annoying from the people who mean well, but comes off really, really badly? Like, you really want to help? Don't do this.
Yes. Don't send me a private. So if I say something publicly, don't send me a private message saying that you agree. I really don't give a fuck if you agree privately. I really need you to say you agree publicly. I hate that. And it happens so often. And I don't quite understand. I don't cool. You agree. Thanks. I know that. I'm the only person that knows you agree. Meanwhile, my ass is still out because I've said this thing publicly and you will not come out and say that you agree publicly. I hate when I say something and then there's a way that folks will seek me out to know that they're not racist. I say something and then they'll tell me the story about how they stood up for this one Black person this one time or this one person of color. This wonderful, cool. I'm trying to go to the bathroom and you're telling me this story. That's wonderful. I think you should just do more of that. And you actually don't need to tell me that you did that thing. Just keep on doing it in your life without letting me know. That's fine. And I'm thinking more about when we were in person. In this particular program where I was learning about psychedelic assisted therapy, I was very, very vocal and in a predominantly white room. And there was a lot of that in the psychedelic community, of a lot of, I think, people just starting to realize, and that's also really frustrating. It's like, I understand that people are just starting to wake up, but literally, we have been here for over 400 years. What the fuck did you think was happening this whole time? What the fuck did you think was happening? Every time someone said, oh, I'm being murdered, and then you saw people, you saw the news and saw people were being murdered, how did you say people are not being murdered? How are you just starting to realize that this is an issue? Indigenous folks in this country, literally, none of us, what has happened to the indigenous folks in this country? Displacement, genocide, the fact that indigenous folks are still struggling in this country, and this is not an issue that we're talking about. The fact that people have an issue with land back. The fact that people might not even know what land back is. You need to do some research. Those things are frustrating. Land back, it just kind of makes sense. If an indigenous person is saying, I want my land back, that shouldn't be a new revelation. It shouldn't be something new to get behind. People were murdered in order for us to live in the places that we live. They deserve to have their land back. And land back it's a lot more than just giving land back. It's a bigger thing, but Google it and folks will find out what that means.
Yeah, there's so much research to be done. And one thing that my wife taught me, who's actually a therapist as well, but has been going to classes for this and taking educational outreach. One of the things I learned from her is it's not okay to be asking whatever Black folks you run across to teach you about what white supremacy is, what the history is here, especially when there's more books than you could read, for the next couple of years about this. There's more YouTube than you can watch. And so that it's not okay to just bug people for your own, to explain the basics and that's why I'm so appreciative of you to come on and share all this when all we have for you is a big box of CBD. But it's something, it's a good CBD.
I'm in.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. But, do you have favorite resources, books or educators who have a lot of stuff online that you like to recommend for folks who want to learn more about all of this?
Honestly, I don't really spend too much time looking at information about white folks to stop being racist. So when people ask me, I Google it. And so I'd say Google is the best resource. How do I stop being racist as a white person? I feel like so much stuff will come up. Books for me to stop being racist as a white person. Am I racist? I'm a white person. Like, I feel like Google is your best friend. Like, you can find so many resources there. And also, like, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do that work. I don't have time to read a book about that's not for me. That's for white folks to deal with whiteness. I don't have time for that. I have other things. I'm supposed to be working on this dissertation. I need to be reading books about that, not white supremacy and me, which is a book that I know is around, I think. But what I do have time for with white folks that actually really want to do this work is I am really getting more into looking at how white folks can work on ancestral practices. And of course, this is informed by my own religious practices with African diasporic religions, right? Like, no one did not do ancestral worship. White folks did ancestral worship in Europe, and then white folks had earth-based practices in Europe. Like, white folks have indigeneity in Europe. And so, like, reconnecting with white indigeneity and white ancestral practices, I think, is part of where the healing for white folks is going to come from. And the answers come from your people. They don't come from us, right? Like, you can connect with your ancestors, and not just the ancestors that did fucked up stuff, right? Like, your ancestors are not just your immediate family. So if you have like ruptures with like grandpa or auntie, that's not just who your ancestors are. Your ancestors are not just the people that did fucked up stuff. There's people that came before them. And as someone who also has like white ancestry, I work with some of my white ancestors, and whenever my feelings get hurt or I have to deal with some sort of backlash, or like I'm struggling with like the ways that white folks treat me in the world, one of the ancestors that shows up for me is this white ancient grandma that I have from Gaul. You know, she has her like big arms wide open to take me into a hug, and like reminds me that there is more than what is just here, and there has been more historically, right? And so I think really being able to, one, go to those ancient ancestors and work with them, but also like overcome the fear, because I think that fear piece that you're talking about is the fear that, one, the fear that I'm racist, the fear that I perpetuate racism, the fear that I have to look and see how my family might have participated in this racism and done like terrible things. And that fear allows people to turn a blind eye. Like, no, like, yes, there's terrible things that happen in the world, and there's ways that we all participate in that, right? Like, for us being folks in the United States, we literally benefit off of wars that happen in other countries. We all perpetuate and participate in fucked up shit. We can't turn a blind eye to it because it helps us feel better, or it's because we want to have our ego intact, or because we want to feel good about ourselves. No, if you actually want to do the work to show up in the world for people of color, to show up in the world for people who are oppressed, that means you look at the fucked up shit that either you're doing, your ancestors did, or whatever, and then you seek to repair it.
I appreciate that, especially about the ancestors, and that your ancestors here in Gaul. I'm actually in France, and this is where my wife is from. And it's been great for her to come back. This is a land of ancient magic. There's a bunch of mysticism and superstition, but it's a land of a lot of these kind of practices, and she can reconnect to them. And my roots are Dutch, and it's a little bit farther away because we kind of think we made money our God pretty quickly, but it's there too. And I really like that idea of being able to reconnect there and to help that be part of your own healing process so you can help heal the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think white folks do pilgrimages to Europe all the time, like the tourist stuff. But what if you actually go to the land? Like, don't just do touristy stuff, but like, I mean, sure, maybe you can do touristy, but touch the land, touch the earth, right? This is where you, like, ancestrally, this is your homeland, right? Like, what does it mean to work with the plants that are there, work with the air that is there, work with the mountain beings, work with the river bodies, like engage with the elements and like the natural wonders of your homeland, and then seek ancestral support and say, hey, I'm here. How do I do something differently whenever I go back to the United States or go back to Canada or go back to wherever you're going back to? Like, how do you pull from the place that you are from in order to show up differently in places where you are inherently oppressing people? how do you do that work? And it's hard work. It's not easy. It's not going to be not tears. It's not going to be not sadness. It's not going to be not shame. All of that stuff is there, and it's actually a part of the work. Like you're supposed to engage that. And as long as you're not engaging that, you're not doing any work.
Yeah, facing the shadow and going home. As Terrence McKenna said, everything is trying to talk to you. This is not a metaphor. And so I had one last question on this topic for people of color who are listening. What advice do you have to share about taking care of their mental health during this time of protests, especially people out there doing the work right now?
Don't be ashamed to find someone that looks like you. I watched This Is Us on NBC, I think. I don't know. One of those major channels. And one of the main characters was adopted by a white family. And initially he had a white therapist. And at one point, there's this episode where he's like, I really enjoyed this and this has been helpful, but there's some things that you can't help me with. And I think I actually need to find like a Black therapist. Like, don't be afraid to feel like you need to work with someone that understands your lived experience a little bit better. Like, now is not the time period for anybody to be teaching their mental health provider how to take care of them. This is not the time period for anybody to have to teach their mental health provider about the realities of their situation. And if you have a mental health provider that says it doesn't matter, I can help you, that's not the right one for you because they don't get it. If I have a client that's trans, I will say, I want to acknowledge that I'm cis and I am an ally to this community, but there are also some things that I will never understand about your trans experience. And I want us to be in conversation about that and see if you actually feel like you might be better served by a trans therapist. We engage that conversation because it's a reality. If there's a therapist that can't engage that conversation or hold that, and you're a person of color and you're seeing them for your mental health, they're going to miss a whole lot of shit.
So from that more difficult topic, maybe to something more fun, ketamine.
Mm-hmm.
So much fun that it is my Achilles heel and the thing I can't have in the house ever. So it's interesting you give lozenges and IM, which means under the skin. Can you just describe what a typical session looks like and what kind of changes you see in people getting ketamine therapy?
So for right now, we actually haven't launched yet. So we're in the process of launching our pilot program. What we have been doing is training. We've been working on ourselves. And I think that this is so important. One, it's completely legal. This is what happens as a therapist who is providing a ketamine experience and inducing an altered state of consciousness. I absolutely need to know what that experience is like to be able to support that. Everyone is going to have a variety of different experiences. And so our team has been training and engaging in ketamine experientials. And even within ourselves, we've been experiencing healing. So I just want to name that we haven't opened our clinic up to the public yet. And we're launching our pilot program with our current therapy clients who meet criteria, of course, to engage in a treatment and see what happens. But our standard processes, we all work from the MAPS protocol and have adopted it for ketamine. So 3 prep sessions, a medicine session, and then we have a medicine session and an integration session is our standard everyone format. And then there's a lot of flexibility after that, depending on what the client needs. Integration is the most important thing, not necessarily the medicine session. And so after you have your medicine session and you have your experience, how do you understand or make meaning of what came up, and how do you apply that to your life? Again, action, right? It's not just about the thoughts or the reflections, and it's not just about the feelings that come up. It's about how you actually move that into what is taking place in your life. I personally believe that when we engage medicine and work with ketamine or whatever medicines might be available, we actually enter into a spirit world, and it's like a different space. It's not just about not being reality. It's about a whole spiritual experience. And there's things that happen in the spirit world first that then trickle down into like our physical world. And so it's really important that you do that work in the spirit world, but you also bring whatever happens into that space, into your physical reality, your day-to-day life here. Because at the end of the day, we're all here and we've agreed to be human for this time period, right? And so like, what healing do we take from that place and bring into our day-to-day life that ultimately serves us on a day-to-day basis, right? It's not just about the experience. So I say that to say that after that basic structure, the number of integration sessions we have or how many medicine sessions we have after that depends on the client and the client's need, and that's determined between the client and the therapist.
That's great. And I really appreciate the spiritual context of that, but also what you were saying earlier, because it does get so lost in mental health today. And I was wondering if you just comment more on how you see spirituality come out of not just your ketamine work, but also your work with clients and how they integrate this into their lives.
Yeah. So I am a person that is tapped into all aspects of myself, my mental, my physical, my spiritual, my emotional self. And so that means that as a therapist, I bring that into the room, and spirituality is a place that we talk. There's also this thing about resonance, and like folks who are attuned to the certain practices that I have or belief systems that I have tend to just show up in my office. And so I can have conversations about ancestral work with most of my clients because for whatever reason, well, I would say that the reason is their ancestors are like, y'all need to get together, right? Like there's stuff that happens on the spirit world where people come to my office. But for whatever reason here in this physical world, I see people that resonates with. Like I have a lot of medicine people in my practice, people that have gifts and abilities and like just like all sorts of amazing, unexplainable things that they're able to tap into and engage with here. And so when I bring my full self, I bring that and we're able to meet in that place. So that's how that shows up kind of in my day-to-day practice. For the ketamine work, I don't know that the spirituality piece is going to resonate for everyone, and it doesn't have to. It's not a requirement that someone believes that they're going to have a spiritual experience in order to be able to receive ketamine from us, especially when we're talking about communities of color, but even more specifically queer communities. Like religious trauma is such a thing that we don't want to push away our community with trigger words or triggers around experiences that they had from like dominant culture, predominantly Abrahamic religions or something like that. So we as practitioners will hold a particular orientation around the spiritual container that we hold. We as practitioners will hold a particular understanding about what happens. And then we meet our clients wherever they're at. So if the client is an atheist, is like, I don't believe in God. Well, we ain't got to talk about God. Like that doesn't have, if you just happen to see gods or goddesses in your experience, we'll talk about how that is for you as an atheist. But I'm not going to tell you that there is a God or there is goddesses and you have to understand the orishas or spiritual beings and entities. I'm not going to do that. So yes, we meet our clients where we're at. We hold the spiritual container and this understanding of what it is. And we also engage in certain practices to make sure that the work is safe on that spiritual level.
And you mentioned queerness, and I did want to move on to sexuality for the end because it is what you have put so much time into and about to get a PhD in. So what led to your interest in working in this field?
I wanted to be an OBGYN. I went to a Black college, which is Xavier University, #1 for sending African-American students to med school. It's a thing. You go to Xavier to be a doctor. And I'm in a sorority, and I was younger on my line, and I had line sisters who were way smarter than me that were struggling. And I was like, if y'all can't do it, I can't do it. So I just need to do something else. I don't want to be a doctor anymore because I don't want to take the MCAT. So I was like, immediately, it was like, oh, I'll be a sex therapist like Dr. Ruth. Sex and sexuality was like always something that I was interested in. My mom was really open about sex. I was an HIV prevention counselor as soon as I could when I turned 18. So I've always been around the sexuality world. My mom was a volunteer at the Berkeley AIDS clinic up here. So there's always been something about sex and sexuality that I've been connected to. And so it was an easy choice. If I'm going to do something for the rest of my life, of course I'm going to study sex. Like what else would it be?
That's what all the great mad people of time have said. Well, what else could I have done here? There was no choice. You work with, it sounds like a really wide array of genders and sexualities and partnership configurations. What's the relationship advice that's universal, that's applying to everybody?
I loved this question when I saw it. Like, yeah, communicate, open your mouth and talk. Like it applies to everyone. so often, I mean, and I actually think like queer folks and people who are in non-monogamous relationships are way better at this than like cishet, like monogamous folks, like, because you have to be able to communicate, especially if you have multiple partners. But communicate. It's so easy to think that someone can read your mind. It's so easy to be mad about something and feel like someone should understand exactly why you're mad. It's so easy to feel shame or insecurity and not want to talk about it. Like, there has to be communication in a relationship. And I think that that is really highlighted by the number one reason. Anytime I have a couple, they'll say, I want to talk about sex. I want to talk about X, Y, and Z. I want to talk about depression. And we don't communicate well. Communication is always the thing that couples say that they struggle with. And it's true, because we're not actually taught how to actually communicate. We're not taught how to have conversations about consent. These are not things that are taught. And so people are told, you get in a relationship and you love someone, but they're not taught about this communication. And so I say communication is the number one universal rule across sexual orientation, gender orientation, relationship configuration, whether you're kinky or not, whatever, you have to communicate.
And it's absolutely, I would see in the polyamorous world, where it seemed like that was their hobby, was processing. It was so much. It was processing all of the time. But also they were relationship ninjas. It was amazing how much was on the table. And you just wouldn't see that as much in the more heteronormative relationships, because things are more easy.
And I think that the communication piece holds so much of what you're saying. Like, if you're communicating, you have to be vulnerable. If you're communicating, you have to talk about boundaries. If you're communicating, you have to talk about what you like. Like, you have to talk about your desires. Like, communication holds so much. That's a part of what is in healthy relationships. When you're communicating, you have to trust. Or if you don't trust, you got to communicate about not trusting, right? Like, everything can get worked. I just feel like everything can get worked through with communication.
That's great. And that would be a perfect spot to end. And I can say that if you want to read more about Courtney's advice on communication, the press section of her website is great. She has all kinds of great interviews that have ideas about communication and some fun ideas for relationships and couples as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing today. It was a really great conversation, and I appreciate you showing up and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. Can I drop a quick plug real quick?
Absolutely. And your link will be in the episode notes.
Okay, perfect. So one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now in the psychedelic assisted therapy community, but also ketamine, is the price tag. So I have actually started a nonprofit, and we recently got 501c3 status. So all donations are tax deductible. Thank you so much. So this nonprofit is aimed at subsidizing the cost of ketamine-assisted therapy for BIPOC, queer, and gender diverse clients. If you would like to support someone being able to receive the healing that they need with ketamine and not have to pay the full price tag, please support, please donate. And I think that this is also a part of like the allyship and the co-conspirator question that you're asking about. Like, put your money behind the healing of folks who are really suffering. Folks might ask, well, why would they pay full fee? Why wouldn't it be sliding scale? And that's also because all of our practitioners are BIPOC, queer, or gender diverse. And like, there's a wage gap that we face in this country. And so my commitment as the owner of this practice, as the owner of this clinic, is that we actually charge market rate. We charge whatever folks who are not BIPOC, not queer, and not gender diverse charge. And so that means that there's this huge access piece that's missing. And the way that I seek to solve it is with a nonprofit. So we are currently accepting donations. I will give you the donation link if folks want to subsidize the cost of therapy for folks who are BIPOC, queer, and gender diverse to be able to receive ketamine-assisted therapy, to be able to receive all the benefits of psychedelics, and especially for those that might not be able to afford it. That would be really great.
A place to put your money where your mouth is. And what's the name of the nonprofit?
It's called Access to Doorways. So our group practice is Doorway Therapeutics. The nonprofit is Access to Doorways, but Doorways is also whatever the psychedelic space opens up for us. So once MDMA is legal and psilocybin is legal, we'll also be adding those to our services as well. And we want to create access to the doorways of healing that psychedelics can provide.
Great. So we'll have links to that in episode notes. And also, if you want to go to Courtney's Doorway site, it's a great place to find wonderful quotes. All over the page is all kinds of wonderful quotes, which I always love to see because it's a bookworm that's doing something else with their life besides just reading. So that was one thing I enjoyed. Well, good. Great. Thank you so much for that work. And again, thank you for sharing with us today.
For sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Courtney for that interview. And as she said, it's everybody's job to learn more. As a drug writer, I spent a lot of time looking at the war on drugs, one of the most nakedly racist machines of societal control ever invented by humans. Here's from the books and works that helped me. For history, one of the most important books I've ever read on slavery is The Cotton Kingdom by Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy who's best known for designing Central Park and Prospect Park in New York City. He was a top journalist of his day, and while he was a correspondent for the New York Times, he took a number of trips through the South before the Civil War to study the, quote, peculiar institution of slavery. It's a damning book. And while some of his views are outdated today, Malcolm X still declared it to be one of the most important books to be read on slavery. Malcolm read it when he was in prison and said that it, quote, opened my eyes to the horror suffered when the slave was landed in the United States. What's striking is how plainly you can witness the patterns seen in this book repeat almost exactly in Jim Crow, then the war on drugs, and now the prison industrial complex. It's not only the moral horror of the system, it's the inefficiency and waste of lives that it causes. And as Frederick Douglass often pointed out, slavery warped the souls of the slave owners and caused a viciousness that seeped into all corners of society. And if that doesn't sound like today, what does? As Dostoevsky remarked, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. Olmsted's book, Cotton Kingdom, helps us to make sense of everything happening in this modern era. The companion book to that one would be The Classic Slave Narratives, edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. Out of the few hundred memoirs written by enslaved persons from around the time of the Civil War, Professor Gates collects 4 of the most well-known. These first-person accounts give a sense of what slavery means, more than any outside perspective. It's terrible to contemplate. To go with that book, you must read something by the most famous formerly enslaved person in the United States, Frederick Douglass, the most photographed person of the 19th century, author of 3 autobiographies, and one of the greatest thinkers and campaigners in United States history. I grew up hearing a lot about Douglass because my father loves him, and he would recommend starting with the second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. Of course, you can learn just as much from fiction as from nonfiction. One of the greats is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Nora Zeal Hurston. Also, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, one of the great storytellers of this century. Read the plays of August Wilson and Lorraine Hansberry about the Black experience, and for a particularly insightful autobiography, The Big Sea by Langston Hughes. For people who like to watch something, the new Netflix documentary series Who Killed Malcolm X is excellent, and I recommend it to anyone. The complicity of the police around Malcolm's murder presage just how the FBI worked to break up the Black Power movements in the 60s and 70s. Remember, for all you hear about the FBI using Operation COINTELPRO to disrupt leftists and the predominantly white student protest movement, the truth is that during that time, the federal government dedicated monumentally more manpower, effort, and dirty tricks into disrupting the Black protesters. The number of assassinations and perversions of justice is astounding. For more on that, there's a free documentary on YouTube called The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. And the patterns repeat today. The protests aren't over, they're just beginning. And for those who clutch their pearls about property damage, we are very lucky that these protests are as nonviolent as they are, considering the depth of the provocation. That last line is actually one from James Baldwin, someone whose name you probably hear a lot these days. But that's because it's reading or watching James Baldwin that is one of the best ways to get your head wrapped around these modern times. America's patterns do not change. The words of Baldwin ring as true today as those of Frederick Douglass from 100 years earlier. Baldwin's words are fiery, but made of tempered steel. Like Douglass, he used humor to make his point, but his point was deadly sharp. He did not hate white people, but he hated the system that led to their unthinking apathy that created a modern apartheid. Anything you can do to learn from James Baldwin will help you to understand race in this country today. For watching to learn more about him, there's a new Netflix documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, based on an unfinished manuscript by Baldwin, and it's incredibly well done. And it's gut-wrenching. You see the vicious white resistance to any kind of racial integration, and it's terrible to watch. You'd like to think that these times are over, but Baldwin's great, sorrowful surprise is to the strength of the apathy in white America, the willing indifference to the fact that there's no place for black people here. If you think these Black Lives Matter protests are overblown, you're part of the problem. The brutal history is as real as the brutal current reality. For 2 more modern books about what's going on and what can be done, my wife recommends My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, by Resba Menachem, as well as Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Also, the writing of Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks is as relevant today as the day it was written. This work is difficult for everyone. It's been going on for a long time, and it will keep going on once we've passed on. You might not have been a cause of the problem, but you can be a part of the solution. In I Am Not Your Negro, one thing that struck me personally was how Baldwin, in contrast to figures like Martin or Malcolm, kept himself apart as a watcher. He was a journalist, a witness to events, and he didn't allow himself to get too entangled in any one movement. It gave him the freedom to move and to see and to synthesize new perspectives. But he described it as a burden. That matters for me because I've never felt like an activist. I'm not someone on the front lines. I'm a writer and a researcher. That's what I do. And so even though it feels paltry in comparison to those protesters on the street and people and organizations working towards systemic change, it's what I feel like I was put here to do. So I'm doing my best with my skill sets to make my little bit of difference. And all I can hope is that it encourages you to use your skills and gifts to help create a more equitable world. Which leads to the last book I'll recommend today, and to the subject where I have the best grasp of it. The book to read, and one of the most important nonfiction books of our generation, is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It's a towering piece of scholarship where she traces how the racist Jim Crow laws of the southern United States morphed and weaponized into the modern war on drugs. And if she happens to hear this, or some friend of hers does, she should know that there's pretty much no one else on the planet that I would rather have on this show. Because the very dark truth is that the war on drugs was birthed in racism, fattened in racism, and reached its present psychotic proportions because of racism. It has always been a war on people of color. There's rumors based off Jack Herrera, the old hemp historian of the 80s, that cannabis was made illegal because of industrial interests. But there's never been any evidence to back that up. And more tellingly, the first anti-marijuana laws were local affairs. The first city to ban cannabis was El Paso, Texas in 1908, right on the border. They couldn't make Mexicans illegal, but they could make their drug of choice illegal. And yes, smoking marijuana was one of the secrets to Pancho Villa's success in the Mexican Revolution. In war, there's nothing like having an army of tough cockroaches smoking Mary Jane who could move fast and hard. La cucaracha indeed. These early local anti-cannabis laws went north, following the Mexican immigration. Previous to that, the very first anti-drug law of all in the U.S. was against opium in San Francisco, because that was a drug of the Chinese. And perhaps the most sensational and racist of all the crackdowns, the war against cocaine began in New Orleans, because as the New York Times famously reported it, cocaine made Negroes superhuman and able to run through bullets. That piece of yellow journalism led to police departments across the South upgrading their service revolvers to .38 specials, a much more powerful gun. It was the first step towards the militarization of the police force that haunts our cities and counties today. Any drug researcher looking at that time will confirm that it was racism and racism alone that led to these early prohibitions. And this was just the early days, before the Reefer Madness campaigns in the 30s and 40s coordinated by Harry Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The racism of his regime, heading America's anti-drug agency, is famous and covered in many books and documentaries. After that, it was Nixon and his cronies who took it to the next level. In the now infamous quote from John Ehrlichman, said to the journalist Dan Baum, "You want to know what this really was about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And remember, all of this was going down while the CIA was a major player in running the heroin out of the Golden Triangle during the Vietnam War. The book to read on that subject is Dr. McCoy's The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which the agency tried to ban. Since Nixon and Reagan, anyone paying attention could see the war on drugs become a stalking horse for a war against people of color, most especially black people. And now, the commercialization of drugs, like cannabis, roars forward in states that still have marijuana criminals in their prisons. The United States has more people in prison per capita than any other nation in the world. More than the genocidal Chinese, more than the autocratic Russians, more than the theocratic Iranians. America jails its own people. And the system is stacked against people of color at every step of the way. It is a national disgrace. End the war on drugs in every way. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out PlusCBDoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code LEXFILES for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.